evening, everyone. Thanks for coming. So today I'm going to be telling you about some of my work on disrupting occupational stereotypes. And this is work that I conducted with my co-authors, Joyce He, Suman To, and Kaylee C. So I want to start out the talk by asking everyone to use their imaginations. So what we're going to do is I want everyone on this side of the room to, in your mind, imagine a nurse. Everyone on that side of the room, imagine as well as you can in your mind an engineer. If you're in the middle, you're not really sure which side you're on, just commit to a side and go with that. And I want you to really think about this person the best that you can. Really imagine, what do they look like? What do they sound like? What kind of clothing do they wear in their job? Do they wear a uniform? And really, close your eyes if you need to. I know it's the end of its day, so probably dangerous to ask people to close your eyes, but stay with me. When you have an image in your mind of that person, raise your hand. Okay, now keep your hands up. If you are imagining a man, put your hand down. Okay, so like most people asked to imagine a nurse, most of you on the nurse side thought of a woman. Like most people who are asked to imagine an engineer, most people thought of a man. And if this is what you did, you'd be largely correct. This is why we do these things. In Canada, women and men are equally represented in the workforce, about 50-50, but 94% of registered nurses are women, while more than 88% of licensed practicing engineers are men. And we refer to this phenomenon as occupational segregation. This is the non-representative distribution of people from various social groups across different occupations. So I'm focusing on gender today for the purpose of this talk, but people can be segregated across any number of different demographic categories, including gender, but also things like race, age, social class, disability status, sexual orientation, the list goes on. A large body of literature exists, and that spans many, many decades, looking at occupational segregation across all of these different kinds of social groups. And it's documented again and again that our social group stereotypes, so the way that we think about men and women, the way that we think about people from different racial groups, contribute to this occupational segregation. So when we're thinking about these female nurses and these male engineers, we're simultaneously activating stereotypes associated with their gender groups, so with the groups of women and men, and also with the occupations themselves. So we have some understanding about what nurses are like and some understanding of what engineers are like, what kind of behaviors nurses are expected to do in their jobs, some idea of what engineers are expected to do in their jobs, and these form those occupational stereotypes. And what I'll argue in this talk is that it's easy for us to think about women as nurses because our stereotypes about nurses overlap with our stereotypes about women and not men. And it's easy to think about men as engineers because our stereotypes about engineers overlap with our stereotypes about men and not women. And in social psychology, we refer to these kinds of effects as fluency. So it's really about how easy it is for us to think about people from these categories as overlapping, and it's easier for us to imagine overlapping categories that have matching stereotypes. Although we have these stereotypes relatively innocuously in order to help us navigate our social worlds, they can become dangerous because they can hurt our academic and work performance, they decrease professional aspirations, identification with stereotype groups and domains, and they introduce bias into every stage of employee selection and promotion. And unfortunately, research and practice have shown us time and time again that stereotypes about social groups are very hard to change. As hard as we've worked to understand and eliminate stereotypes, they remain pervasive. They're not going to go away. So in this research, we started thinking, well, look, we've tried for decades to focus on trying to change stereotypes that exist about social groups. So to change the way that people think about men or change the way that people think about women. But those stereotypes are so entrenched, they're very hard to move at all. So we started thinking, what about the occupations that exist about occupations themselves? Why don't we shift our focus away from changing how we think about men and women? Because how does that usually end up looking? It usually ends up looking like this, right? It usually ends up having people think about how they can fix the women to get them to act more like men. Women are told, you need to lean in, you need to speak up, you need to ask for more things, don't be so nice. And unfortunately, what happens is that approach doesn't really get us anywhere because women end up being penalized for acting like women and penalized for acting like men. This is a classic double bind faced by professional women. So we wanted to move our focus off of gender stereotypes and how we think about women to how we think about the occupations themselves. It's been very hard to change how we think about women to make that overlap with engineers more fluent. So we thought maybe we'd have better luck in shifting how we're thinking about engineers so that some of that stereotype overlaps with how we think about women to make that more fluent. So our research questions for this work were, what stereotypes do people hold specifically about different occupations? In order to disrupt those occupational stereotypes, we really need to have a strong understanding of them. And can occupational segregation be partially explained as a consequence of this stereotype incongruence? So the mismatch between the gender stereotypes and the occupational stereotypes. And both of those lead up to the main research question, which we're pursuing right now, is if we can actually decrease gender segregation by disrupting the occupational stereotypes. So what did we do? In developing the theory and method for this project, we focused on the stereotype content model, which is a common framework for understanding social group stereotypes, and it situates stereotypes along two fundamental dimensions, warmth and competence. Warmth refers to our judgments about how warm, good-natured, sincere, friendly, well-intentioned, trustworthy a group is, and it really boils down to our assessment of whether members of a specific group are either cooperative or competitive with our social group. And competence refers to judgments based on how competent, capable, intelligent, efficient, skillful, confident a group is, and it boils down to our assessment of that group's status in society. Within this model, again, decades of research looking at these stereotypes has shown that women are stereotyped as higher in warmth and relatively lower in competence compared to men. So in our research, we used this stereotype content model to develop the first ever systemic taxonomy of occupational stereotypes, to situate them on this same grid in which we already understand so much about social group stereotypes. Then we examined labor force representation data to see if the congruence between the occupational gender stereotypes would actually predict who was in those jobs. So in our first study, we asked just over 1,000 participants to complete a questionnaire where they rated 61 different job titles for warmth and competence. And we were able to look at our results with warmth controlling for competence and competence controlling for warmth, so we don't just see an overall halo effect, and we can really separate those out. These are our results. It's a bit small, but hopefully you can see where your occupation falls here. And what we can readily observe here is looking at these occupations on this grid of warmth and competence is that occupations really vary widely in terms of their perceived warmth and competence. Some groups are perceived to be warm, but not particularly competent, so childcare workers, secretaries. Other groups are perceived to be extremely competent, but not particularly warm, so lawyers or CEOs. Unemployed individuals tend to be perceived as low on both warmth and competence. And other occupations seem to fall in the middle. So, we see tech support workers, musicians, police officers fall somewhere in the middle of that. After constructing this taxonomy, which provides this comprehensive picture of occupational stereotypes, we wanted to see how this grid might predict the actual representation of different social groups, particularly men and women, in these jobs. So in the second study, we obtained annual average employment gender composition information from a number of different sources, and we looked at how those correlated with the occupational warmth and competence ratings in this study. Looking at our first result for warmth, we found that occupational warmth ratings, which are on the X or horizontal axis at the bottom, the higher that goes, the more warm the occupation is seen. And on the horizontal axis, on the vertical or Y-axis, we have the percentage of women. The higher that is, the more women in the job. Those warmth ratings were positively correlated with the percentage of women in the job. Again, this makes sense because women are stereotyped as high warmth, but low competence. And that's what we saw for competence, that jobs more commonly held by women were perceived as marginally lower competence, and this makes sense again because women are stereotyped as lower on competence. And I'm only showing you these results for men and women today, just in the interest of time, but we were also able to predict racial representation for Black, Asian, and Hispanic workers, and those findings are included in the magazine that you'll go home with later today, so you can check those out. So this project provides the first taxonomy of occupational stereotypes, situating those stereotypes according to the dimensions of warmth and competence, through which we really understand other social group stereotypes. And our results suggest that occupational segregation is associated with stereotype incongruence, such that men and women are better represented in occupations that are stereotypically congruent. So of course, Statistics 101, we know that correlation is not causation, so the next thing that we wanted to do is look at this experimentally. So we wanted to see if we can actually disrupt those occupational stereotypes to increase the number of women that we have in a particular job. And we do this by disrupting the occupational stereotype and not doing anything about what the women themselves should be doing. So we looked specifically at gendered language in job advertisements. Research suggests that gendered language in job descriptions is one factor that contributes to women's underrepresentation in male-dominated positions. So as an example, male-dominated jobs often contain more masculine language, so things like assertive, competitive, ambitious, and that ends up deterring women from applying for these jobs. So in the example I have up here, from this paper, they have a company description that says, we are a community of engineers who have effective relationships with many satisfied clients, which what they associate as having more feminine language. And then the masculine version of that is, we are a dominant engineering firm that boasts many leading clients. So it's just these subtle changes that have these effects on whether or not women will actually apply. So we partnered with a large Canadian organization for this study. We took an existing job description for a job that they have, where they have the lowest representation of women, and we administered the intervention by changing gendered language in that job description, by removing masculine language and replacing it with gender neutral or feminine language. So we replaced the phrase entrepreneurial and desire to drive results, which are characterized as stereotypically masculine, with just a subtle change, a willingness to pursue new and creative ideas, and the motivation to achieve results. So far, we've collected 28 applications across 35 months. This is ongoing, and we have applicant data both pre and post the intervention. And so far, what we've seen is a 4% increase in female applicants, and we see that the change in the proportion of women applying to the job is driven by the significant increase in the number of women applying, with no significant change to the total number of men who are applying. So we see that we can debias the job posting by making it more congruent with what women are attracted to in the job application, without doing any harm to the men who are also interested in applying. So think back to the beginning of this talk when I asked you to think about engineers and nurses. Thinking about engineers and thinking about the stereotypes that exist about engineers is extremely timely now in Canada. Engineers Canada has a goal, a 30 by 30 goal, of having 30% of newly licensed engineers be women by 2030. And some of the work that we're doing right now is looking at how they've been attempting to do this. What are the advertisements, what do the recruitment campaigns look like that they've been using? Typically, those have been the types of fix the women, fix the girls campaigns that I told you about that don't work, really focused on making women more analytical, making them, act more in ways that are supposed to align them with men who typically have been interested in engineering. Those early efforts have not been that successful, but what we've seen lately is a shift towards these kinds of advertisements. So you can see this one says, get a job as a chief engineer of saving children's lives. This advertisement doesn't tell girls or women to do anything at all. It instead highlights an aspect of engineering which is real, but hasn't been thought of as much because it's not typically part of the stereotype that we hold about engineers. So the people who developed this advertisement said, I think women are more attracted by the element of social good in engineering. With our campaigns, we think in terms of how, what, and why a brand is doing something. The why sets you apart. It's so important. So we wanted to show the products of engineering in our campaign. These are products which change lives. So these are the kinds of advertisements that we're looking at to see if they have any change in terms of the number of girls and women who sign up. And it's this kind of disruption of occupational stereotypes which might finally help us make progress to reducing occupational segregation.